So Karin, welcome to Craft Skills for Garden Conservation, and please tell us all about your work.
Thank you very much. So my name, as Kate told you, is Karin Lindeblad, and I'm working in Sweden, mainly in the central parts of Sweden, and I'm working with excavations in historical gardens from the Viking Age to the 1850s, about 1850s. And the Viking Age starts at 850, so it's about it's a long period, it's about 1,000 years. And today I'm going to talk very briefly, of course, about garden soil, but first a very short introduction to garden archaeology. In Sweden, there are mainly two fields of garden archaeology. We work in parks, by castles and manors, and then we deliver information, historical information about the gardens before the gardens will be restored or reconstructed. And these gardens are still, and parks are still visible and often in use. And then we have the contract archaeology, when someone is going to build a new house in a town, or whether it's a parking place, you have to do an excavation ahead of that. And these gardens are, of course, not visible in the landscape today. And I will talk mainly about these types of garden soils today. At garden archaeological excavations, we of course use archaeological methods, but we also use other kind of analysis and source materials. And here you can see some of them. You can see ground penetration radar, where we can identify features underneath today's surface. For example, pathways, wells, etc., under the ground. And it's sometimes a very useful method. We work together with archaeobotanists who study in microscope the garden soils, the contents of the garden soils, and I will get back to that. We use historical maps, and to the right, down to the right, you see a historical garden from the town of Norrköping in Sweden in the 1800s. And they might be very useful, especially when the garden is not visible today. And sometimes we also, that's me, sending apples to experts to see what kind of apple trees that are still growing in the garden. And this is a historical map, just as an example how you can work with them. The surveyor, this is a map from 1696 of the Swedish town of Linköping. And the surveyors, they have written down which part of the town is used. For orchard is the yellow one. Next to the cathedral of Linköping, you have a very large one, for example. And that we have marked green is the kitchen gardens. And the fields in the town, they are light green. As you can see, Linköping at the end of the 1600s was a very green town. And that's quite new results in Swedish archaeology. And you can see at the top, I have written excavation area, and we'll have a look at two town yards from the 1600s, a reconstruction of them. This is, you can say, a typical medieval and early modern town yards in Sweden. In the middle of the plot, there is a it's the dwelling house, and in front you have the main road, and you have economy buildings ahead of the dwelling buildings. And the gardens in the town yards, they're always at the very back of the town plot. And they might be as much as 1/3 of the town plot that the people living in the towns, I forgot the word, used their plots for kitchen gardens. And they are always the enclosed areas, as you can see, with wooden fences. You have cultivation beds that we sometimes can study archaeological, and almost all the town plots had their own well for cooking and so on, but of course also for the gardening. And this is what it looks like at an archaeological site. You see a well to the left. You see wooden bins to the top right, and Maria Flink will talk about later about them. It's like they're used for compost in the gardens, and they're always placed at the very back in the garden. And to the bottom right, you see a fallen fence from the Middle Ages in the town of Linköping. That's how the gardens were enclosed in the Middle Ages and early modern times. And this is a section through garden soil in the town of Norrköping in Sweden. It's not special for this town. It always looks like this. At the bottom, you can see the yellow natural sand. And then you see about the garden soil. It's about 30 centimeters in thickness. And very special for the kitchen gardens in the towns is that you have used a spade blade to work in the garden. And I don't know if you can see it, but at the interface between the garden soil and the yellow sand, you can see marks from a spade blade digging into the yellow sand. And here is another section through a garden that was not visible at all in Stockholm before we excavated it 2020. In this section, you can see the clay. It's the natural soil in the bottom. And at the upper part, you can see the remains of a stone building. And between the clay and the stone building, in the left parts, you see the garden soils, and it's about 70 centimeter thick and quite homogeneous, as they always are, because you have been digging for centuries through them. And to the right, on top and to the left of the stick, red and white stick, you can see walkways that are made out of gravel in several layers. They had changed from yellow sand to thicker gravel. That's something we study as well. This is a garden from the 1600s to the about 1800s. And this is out in the countryside. It's a vicar's garden outside the town of Norrköping in Sweden. And you see my colleague Alf, he's standing on the natural soil. And behind him, you can see a section of the garden soils. And as you understand the length of Alf, you can see it's about 1 meter thick garden soils. And this is how we excavate them to get there is no stratigraphy, often no stratigraphy in them. So we have to use, to date the garden soils, we have to use the artifacts that we find in the garden soil. And this is what Alf found in this garden soil. It's an example what you can find. It's waste from the kitchen, and you could call it compost, but it's not compost in that way that we see it now, really, because you see it's potsherds, it's planting pots, it's clay pipes and coins. So the artifacts that we find in the garden soil, they can tell us about the household who used the garden, when the garden was in use, and sometimes also about what kind of tools you have used in the garden. And you can see it's rubbish from the household, potsherds, for example, but also things that people have lost, the gardeners and the people working in the garden, they have lost in the garden, like the coins you see there. It's one is from 1740. And the clay pipes, it's of course from the people working in the gardens as well. And there is also small pieces of planting pots, but you can see it better in the next picture. These are planting pots found in garden soils, and in Sweden they are used from about the 1600s and onwards. And the older ones, they are made by hand, but they look a lot like the planting pots today, and you can find really, really tiny ones up to the size of, in diameter, about 20 centimeters or something like that. And we mainly find them in larger gardens, like where they have had greenhouses and things like that. Not that much in the towns. And these are example on medieval a medieval rake and a medieval spade blade in iron, found in a garden in the medieval town of Vadstena, probably used by the gardeners in the 1400s. And here in the picture you can see cultivation. The darker structures in the light sand, they are cultivation beds, as you can see in the medieval wooden carving as well. They are often about 1.2 meters. It's the 2 alna, it's the old Swedish measurement, and they are perfect to work in from 2 sides. And these planting beds, they are from the medieval times, about the 1400s. You can see the spade blades to the left, and in the fields they used ard. You can see it in the picture to the right at the bottom, the marks of the ard. And sometimes it happens that we can see the seeds in the garden soil. You see peach, and at the bottom it's elder seeds. And quite often it starts to grow as well after our excavations, the year afterwards. And the picture to the right is an example of that from the garden in Stockholm I was talking about, and it's a Thornapple, but we had other plants as well. And this is a picture of my colleague Jens Heimdal, who is an botanist. We take samples from the soils, and he helps us to identify the seeds in the gardens. And here you have thornapple at the top and chickpea at the bottom. But he doesn't only identify seeds in the garden soils. This is examples on what you can find as well. You can see how the people have, what kind of fertilization were used, what kind of compost. You can see signs of irrigation. So there is a lot of information about the gardens and the gardeners in the garden soils, that it's not visible until you look at it in microscope. And these are examples of seeds from medieval kitchen gardens and orchards in Swedish towns. You see vegetables, it's kale at the top, kale, parsnip, and beetroot. And herbs like oregano, coriander, and lavender. For example, coriander has been in use from the Viking Age and onwards. Maybe people think most people think it's a new herb. And then you see medical plant, it's motherworth, and example of trees is pear. Our excavations and results from the garden archaeological excavation the last 20 years has changed the traditional picture of the horticultural progress in Sweden in many ways. This is the old picture, and you can still read it in books, that it's the monastery and the convents that brought the horticulture to Sweden. But this is no longer true. It's a much more complicated pictures. And with new excavations and new results, this picture would probably deepen and get even more complex. And here are some works, if you're interested in garden history and garden archaeology. They are in Swedish, but I can recommend this book to the left. It's quite new. It's Swedish garden history. And to the right, there's another book. I can't translate it right now. It's about gardening as well. And if you're interested in our excavations, you can follow us on our website, www.archeologerna.com, or on Instagram, Archeologerna. You can follow our excavations and our results and get our reports and the new project that I'm working with. Thank you.